The stuff that I'm going to introduce to you right now, this stuff called ProSocial, really comes out of B.F. Skinner's work in 1966, where he kind of shifted. Originally, Skinner talked about reinforcement, the reinforcing of behavior in terms of a strengthening of a particular response. Like a response is seen kind of as a muscle. And later on, he began to become more and more committed to the idea that the study of behavior is a direct parallel to the study of evolution. And in evolutionary science, one looks at natural selection as the mechanism by which species adapt or fail to adapt over generations upon generations. Natural selection has a direct parallel, in Skinner's view, to behavioral selection. And in addition to that, Skinner argued that there was a third parallel, which is cultural selection. And it's these combinations of natural selection, behavioral selection, and cultural selection that Skinner spent the last part of his life fleshing out in Science and Human Behavior and other works. Now, Steve Hayes was a student who was deeply moved by B.F. Skinner's work and also was interested in green behavior. And with one of his colleagues, whose name was Jim Cohen, his first book was on developing sustainable practices in large communities and municipalities in the United States. Simultaneously, Steve developed what I've been talking with you about, the basic science of language and cognition that we call relational frame theory. Also simultaneously, he developed a philosophy of science that extended B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism. And this philosophy of science is called functional contextualism. And really what the argument is that radical behaviorism is the quintessential functional contextualist approach to understanding, developing scientific endeavor and generating scientific knowledge. Tony Biglin was originally an organizational psychologist who became interested in doing prevention work. He became interested in being a clinical psychologist and developed a secondary degree as a clinical psychologist, and subsequently became interested in prevention science and epidemiology. Why? Because these scientific approaches were capable of generating the data that people in the United States were willing to listen to when dealing with issues like smoking cessation and climate control. These are big issues that Tony felt behavior science would be able to address and would be able to develop a technology for influencing change at a big level, at a societal level. And this was always Skinner's dream. It was always Skinner's dream to be able to develop a technology for cultures to design themselves in such a way that they survive. David Sloan Wilson is an evolutionary biologist who had been in mortal combat with E.O. Wilson. E.O. Wilson was an evolutionary biologist who argued that the basis of natural selection was genetics. Kin selection was what he argued was the basic way that species adapt over several different generalizations. And David Sloan Wilson, no relation to E.O. Wilson, argued, wait a minute, there's many different levels of selection. Behavioral selection, cultural selection, natural selection, all seem to make sense to him. In other words, he was arguing the exact same thing that B.F. Skinner was arguing. And when David Sloan Wilson came across the works of B.F. Skinner, he was like, oh my God, I have to meet these people. And he contacted Tony Biglin, who put David Sloan Wilson in touch with Steve Hayes. So now here's David Sloan Wilson, who becomes connected to Steve Hayes and to Tony Biglin, who were interested in scaling up radical behaviorism and behavior analytic ways of dealing with complex human problems to help design a culture. And David reads Elinor Ostrom's 2009 Nobel Prize-winning work in economics on managing the commons. And what she found was startling. What she found was that groups that organized themselves around 8 design principles were highly likely to not just survive, but to thrive, to really, really function well. She was able to identify these 8 design principles, and she wrote them up as a study that involved her observations across the globe that she did on this Fulbright scholarship, and for that she won the Nobel Prize in economics. The design principles that she developed, that she saw these groups using effectively, included, number 1, a strong sense of mission or purpose or collective purpose, right? A sense of our unity as a group. Number 2, a sense of equal distribution of resources and inputs and outputs. So if I'm going to put in this much, I'm going to get back that much. And I'm going to expect that you're going to put in this much in order to get back that much. Equal distribution of resources and input. Expectations aligned with reinforcer magnitude. The next is that there's going to be a system for decision-making that is both fair and inclusive. And to the extent possible, what Ostrom found was that the more people that could be involved in decision-making for the group, the better. The more inclusive the decision-making, including those people at the very bottom of a group all the way up to the people at the top of the group, the more likely it is that people are going to adhere to the decisions that are made. Why? Because they're key, because they were involved in creating it. Likewise, Ostrom found that there's going to be situations where people are left to go and do things and there's nobody there to see them. And so we need to figure out a way to monitor people's performance over time so that we make certain that they do what they said they were going to do. Sometimes that involves punishment, but not necessarily. It may involve a better system of reinforcement. But it also may involve punishment, and we may need to be able to figure out what are the best ways to sanction misbehavior that immediately decelerates problem behavior and then gives them an opportunity to realign their behavior with the expectations of the group. Sometimes people in a group don't agree, and they get into fights and squabbles with each other. And it's important that people who are in conflicts have a fair and very, very rapid way by which to bring their conflicts to the group and get help from the group in order to resolve these conflicts. And so having a conflict resolution process is very important for a group's long-term survival. Groups need some kind of sense of what their personal and group level of autonomy is. And let's say that this is an organization. There is the pre-production group, there's the marketing group, there's the production group, there's the safety group, there is the quality monitoring group, there's human resources, there's legal. All these different groups are important, and each one needs to have some capacity to self-govern, has to have a little bit of autonomy in how they organize themselves, but they also need to have some relationship to the larger group to which they're connected. And it's this dynamic between being autonomous in a semi-capacity and also being connected to the larger group that forms the last part of Ostrom's 8 design principles. So here you have the basic model. And we have all of these different players who came together to put together a way to take ACT and make it useful to helping groups design themselves for sustainability. It's a little bit like playing 3 or 4 dimensional chess when you bring together economics, evolutionary theory, prevention science, and psychology.